on the other one, you bastard!
The Transformers franchise has been going on for such a long time that it's important to remember that not everyone grew up with Generation 1, like myself for example. Thanks to this, there are quite a few misconceptions with Generation 1 as a whole, especially with many of the figures that came out during the early 90s. The first thing to note is that Generation 1 was incredibly long, possibly one of the longest sub-franchises within the greater Transformers tapestry, playing only second fiddle to the live-action movie franchise. The second misconception to clear up is the importance of Generation 2. It wasn't actually as successful as many people consider. It was actually only 2 years, which is far shorter than most lines we get nowadays, and also it was a financial failure, almost tanking the entire franchise until Beast Wars managed to save it. The third is that many of the figures that people consider G2 aren't actually G2. For example, Thunderclash is actually Euro G1, or if we're being colloquial, G1.5. He may never have been released in America, but he was very much in the G1 element of the franchise. But the biggest misconception is the quality of G1 figures pre- and post-movie, because there is actually a huge difference. Upon the release of the 1986 movie, Hasbro somewhat had a falling out with Takara and then realized they had to make their own toys, instead of just importing toys from Japan. So the period after it was a little bit wibbly. So the question is the engineering style between those two types of figures really that different? And is the charm of some of the post-movie but pre-G2 figures truly justified? Well, to answer that question, greetings Cybertronians, I'm DrLockdown, and today's diagnosis pertains to Generation 1 Predator Stalker. Now, there are a couple of things to note when purchasing one of these bad boys on the aftermarket, but most of those will come naturally whilst in the process of reviewing him. For now, though, the most important is the fact that most will come without a rocket launcher, although it doesn't actually launch any rockets, it's just for show. Now, hunting down one of these bad boys isn't impossible, provided you aren't using eBay. Seriously, just use Facebook groups like a normal person. But know that you may have to perform some repairs on the peg here. Many copies have had it broken off over time, which is the main reason why so many of the aftermarket pieces omit the element entirely. That said, I feel that without the rocket launcher, Stalker unfortunately feels a little bit bland. The rocket launcher is at least a third of the vehicle mode's identity, so purchasing one without it is a bit of a gamble. But enough sidetracking. Stalker transforms into a futuristic military vehicle, and if ever there was a perfect blend of 80s and 90s, this would be it. The design and sculpt work is completely 80s, fitting right at home with the sci-fi action blockbusters that were ever present in the period. It's weird and wacky, yet with a hint of the utilitarian. Strangely enough, the rocket is more of a Thunderbirds vibe going on, although those designs were technically the 1980s from a 1960s perspective, so I guess in a vague sense it sorta counts. The sculpted detail is also done very well, almost on the level of modern Siege figures to be honest. Sadly, the plastic type they chose does cause some of it to feel a little bit softer than it should, but it's nowhere near as bad as some modern examples. That said, this in no way feels like a toy from the 80s, thanks to the completely on-point 90s colour scheme. I know there were toys in that time period that did sport this colour palette, but let's be real here, these colours are totally radical, dude. I think the one element that really sells this as being more 90s than 80s is the depiction of the windscreen. This neon lime really pops out at you and brings forth a source of sinister energy, which is fitting for such a warmonger of a character. That said, I do wish there was a lot more of it on the body. Matter of fact, he is a bit light on paint, even by G1 standards, or rather overall G1 standards. Figures post-1986 tended to have a lot less paint, partially because they had less diecast as well. But in both pre- and post instances, they do compensate with a healthy dose of stickers, which I didn't get on my original copy. Thankfully, the missile, which I tracked down after the main figure, did retain its stickered detail, although I'm not really sure how I feel about the checkered details on the side. The main body didn't have any when I originally purchased him though. Hell, even the con symbol is just a repro label I added on afterwards. I don't exactly think he needs to be disguising himself when he's literally a turquoise and fuchsia alien space tank, and before you ask, yes, that is the correct pronunciation.
It's pronounced fuchsia, you idiot.
Still, the missing sticker detail is something you're going to have to get over if you find a cheap copy, as most copies that retain them are, well, let's say just a bit ridiculous. All you're really missing on the vehicle mode are the lights at the front and some detail on the bronze door here, and I reckon I can pretty easily add the former in my own spare time after the review. Fun fact, this video is massively overdue, so I had plenty of time to actually go back and add those painted details myself. Aside from those chest details, which will become a lot more apparent later, I also added the main feature of the vehicle mode, being the green lights, and they really do bring the figure to life. I also managed to touch up the bronze bit over here because it was a bit scuffed up on my regular copy, so I performed a bit of repairs to the paint, let's just say that. Whatever the case, I think it looks much better this way, and it's a super easy paint job to do, so if you have some paints lying around, I highly recommend doing it. Besides, the bronze door on its own is painted remarkably well. It doesn't show up often on Transformers, so we don't really have a lot to compare it to, but from personal experience, bronze is one of the hardest colors to pull off, coming in slightly below red and yellow. If you want to see an example of bronze done sloppily, look no further than BotCon 2013 Sandstorm. Yeesh. You know, I was this close to reviewing him, but a certain commenter had to keep pestering me about reviewing the base Skyhammer mold, and then he started harassing other commenters, so, look forward to that review in an eternity after I purposefully delay it. Feel free to talk me, but don't harass other commenters, please. It's a dick move. But moving aside, Neon Green also comes in spades if you get yours with missiles, which I opted out for on the aftermarket because they were so bloody expensive. I am kind of regretting it though, because they do look quite lovely. There's ports all over him that allow you to peg them on, and before you ask, yes, they are coincidentally War for Cybertron blast effects compatible. The other reason I didn't buy any missiles initially, though, was to do with some of the build quality issues. Now, contrary to popular belief, Stalker himself does not have gold plastic syndrome. All of the bronze elements are done in paint, so you won't need to worry about anything breaking. The same cannot be said about his gun, though. Yeah, I didn't ask for this. The seller who sold me the missile launcher literally gave this away because no one in their right mind would dare buy this thing. If anyone offers you this gun, don't pay money for it. You're only wasting money that you could be spending on much more important things, like Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. Anyway, in terms of other accessories, you also get a satellite dish. It plugs into the side, and I guess it's alright. It has a little bit more visual flair, but ultimately I could take it or leave it. And finally, that brings us to the rocket launcher. Given the clear parts of the front, it kinda looks more like a death ray, but this does have a purpose. If you look on the inside, it actually has a flip-up schematic of Rotorstorm, which I suppose acts as some nifty cross-promotion to coerce kids into buying one, even though they technically have no other cross-compatibility. Fun fact, I had a chance to purchase a G1 Rotorstorm last Supernova, but I ended up choosing G1 Trigger Happy instead. I reckon I made the right choice. The rotation of the turret is one of my main gripes with the figure. You unfortunately have to remove it fully and then plug it back in again at a slight angle, because the back section here locks into place. Furthermore, the connection port is a smidge too loose for my taste. I know there's not a lot you can complain about on a Generation 1 toy, given that it was still early days for the franchise, but if there's anywhere you can complain, it's easily the vehicle mode, since that's usually what the designers prioritized. Granted, it's not the worst system ever, but a better connection peg would have been nice. Still, I'm sure a potential update would do a much better job if we ever get one. My other gripe is that the arms are completely visible from the back. I suppose it's not completely terrible, but folding in a bit better would have been nice. Still, I suppose there are budgets to consider, so it's easily ignored. Oh, and the platform for the missile looks a smidge underdone. A minor annoyance, and I imagine that's a personal gripe more than a genuine criticism. Otherwise, it's a fantastically done alt mode. Size-wise, TFWiki lists him as a medium predator, which sounds incredibly ominous, but by modern standards, he pretty squarely fits into the Voyager size class, aside from his missile launcher, which I guess makes him more of a modern leader. Size classes these days are somewhat whack, to say the least. This may actually put a roadblock on his potential update status, because whilst I personally feel a Generations remake is definitely in order, the Voyager price point is often reserved for more recognizable characters or characters with a bit more complex engineering. It seems more likely that they'd remake him in the deluxe bracket, and I feel that would be doing him dirty. Still, to be fair, Double Dealer got the leader class treatment, and then there's all the weirdos in Studio Series, so maybe his chances are better than one would think. Although I'd hope is a little bit better than Double Dealer's design. Yeah, I know I said I'd stop complaining about toys that haven't come out yet, but sometimes too far is too far. Stalker's transformation is dead simple, even by Generation 1 standards. And that's because Hasbro used much simpler engineering after the 1986 movie when they had to figure things out on their own. They just had to do what they could with what they had. You don't have to take the weapon off, but it does make things a lot easier. And no, parts forming, weapon parts forming, I think at this stage it's pretty clear that weapon parts forming is kind of a non-issue, but other forms of parts forming can be. It helps if you do the leg section first. First thing you want to do is bring up these panels here, then take this whole section and rotate it out like so, and as you do, you'll notice that it actually kind of shifts to the outside to make a nice gap between the legs. Then you close up your panels. Arms are next. First thing you want to do is bring the shoulder panels down like so, and that will give you clearance to open up the arms. Before you bring the arms down, you just want to rotate this whole thing 180 degrees and it'll sort of lock into place. You can then bring the arms down on their ratchets, but if you still got the satellite dish on there, you will need to put that backwards as opposed to forwards. And last but not least, you take this panel here, rotate it around, which will reveal the chest, and then grab the head. There's actually a little groove there to put your fingernail on, and the head locks into place up there like so. So yeah, anyone expecting something overcomplicated, I don't know what to tell you, man. It's a Generation 1 figure. It's One and done, that's it. What were you hoping for? It's supposed to be big, chunky fun. And that's what you get. There might have been some confusion about which line Stalker was in when it came to vehicle mode, but for robot mode, the sheer brickitude leaves no doubt whatsoever. This guy is one chunky motherfucker. And honestly, there are few robots I've seen that truly exude the 80s robot aesthetic more than this. Now, for all 5 of you who grew up with the utter failure that is Machine Wars, you may recognize a somewhat similar appearance to their version of Soundwave. And yes, you'd be correct. This was indeed redecoed into Soundwave, despite the fact that this virtually looks nothing like Soundwave, although I suppose the same could be said about the Movieverse version. Now, whilst the immediate period after the 1986 movie was fraught with poorly designed messes, at this point Hasbro had finally gotten the hang of making robots that actually looked cohesive. And whilst not all the figures at the time had truly gotten rid of the post-movie jank, case in point the other Predators, Stalker manages to rise above it quite well. Right off the bat, the proportions outclassed most of the other Transformers at the time. Granted, this would become the norm over the next 2 years with the introduction of Generation 2, but I think part of Stalker's lasting charm is how well executed the robot mode is. Unfortunately, this comes at the cost of virtually any articulation whatsoever, even by G1 standards. But let's be realistic here, who buys a Generation 1 toy for articulation? Who in their right mind would commit such insanity? The sculptor detail is, again, immaculate. There are tons of purposeful seam lines and grill sections to make this guy look far more foreboding than one would expect. I swear to God, if they try to smooth this shit out for a potential update, I'll be incredibly mad. The colors are also, once again, very well laid out. It probably helps that there's basically no kibble, which is kind of the standard for most G1 figures anyway, but especially with Stalker, you get nice big chunks of big, beefy colors. Even without the stickers, the robot mode is incredibly well realized, although their inclusion would have been nice. What I'm really missing is the extra bronze on the chest. I can paint it myself, but as I said, bronze is a very difficult color to do, so I've probably got my work cut out for me. You can see here in robot mode, I also added the sticker detail in the form of paint, but here it was a much bigger pain in the ass. I added some yellow to the arms, which is just like the yellow and blue detail, but I did not do the blue outlines because, well, I don't trust myself that much with the paint. I did give the red here a shot, and it did turn out mostly alright, but I wouldn't trust myself to replicate it. Surprisingly, the light green here was also a pain in the ass, because I kept sticking my finger on it mid-paint, and I kept rubbing it off. But the hardest part was getting these bronze sections painted. Needed a lot of masking, needed a lot of careful planning. It was generally very difficult to do. I would not recommend doing it if you're not confident with painting, but hey, I think it turned out alright in the end. Hooray! Accessory-wise, it's basically the same affair as vehicle mode. The radar dish works alright, at least as well as it did in vehicle mode, but I can't help but feel the rocket launcher looks out of place. I'm sure a potential update could fix this, but as is, I just like to keep it in its vehicle mode storage. The weight distribution is perfectly balanced, allowing for basically any pose that this guy is in to be able to hold the weight properly. Of course, being a Generation 1 figure, there's virtually no posability to speak of. The head is nothing, the shoulders ratchet forwards, the elbows move inwards but not forwards, he has a waist swivel but no hips, and the knees bend, but only if you open up the flaps on the back. So yeah, posability is dog shit, but this is a pre-G2 figure. Posing power is not the main game here. And honestly, I think this doesn't matter when you consider that his proportions are much better than his at the time contemporaries. Yes, the play value is pretty piss poor, but back in those days you didn't really need those same play options. It was a simpler time, and even today that charm is not lost on him at all. Size-wise, he is again pretty well fit into the Voyager category, especially considering the lack of Decepticons in Generations lately, and no, I'm not counting Studio Series. Stalker would be a welcome addition. Of course, that begs the question, how would they update Stalker? Well, I reckon the legs would remain largely unchanged. We've already seen this transformation time and time again, even in modern times. I imagine the chest would be extremely simplified to account for the new arm storage, and honestly I'm all for it. The old version actually sports a little bit of hollowness to facilitate the flip around, so managing to fix this would be a welcome addition. The head would obviously be smaller, and I'm hoping they retain the light piping. Considering the sheer lack of it on other Generations figures these days, I reckon they will omit it if they ever do make an update, but a man can dream, can't he? But that's all if they choose to update him, and for all we know they might decide not to. As stated earlier, the Voyager price point is a bit of a hurdle, as they can't just make a deluxe and call it a day, since there's greater ramifications if he doesn't sell well. Furthermore, they would have to change the name. Now I know a bunch of you will cry foul, claiming that the world is too sensitive over these sorts of things, and whilst I think there are some limits to that argument, for example naming a Transformers Spastic is in incredibly poor taste. In this instance I don't think it's that disrespectful to have a missile launcher called Stalker, but regardless of what we as Transformers fans think, if the general public claims that it's offensive, then Hasbro can't make money. And whether right or wrong, if Hasbro can't make money, then they have to change the name. Yes, slag does mean molten metal, but if they called him slag, then the UK would be in an uproar and people would be boycotting the whole Hasbro Hasbro brand. Say what you like about people's stupidity, they still have to sell toys to stupid people. But beyond all of those hurdles, if they do end up remaking him, Hasbro has already set a precedent for making really good updates of purple and turquoise Decepticons. Never say never. Unless it's Double Dealer, in which case, maybe never would have been better off. I'm not going to deny that even in 1992, a lot of the post-movie jank was still heavily present, but Stalker definitely manages to rise above it. And that's the secret to his charm. With his incredibly well-realized robots and vehicle modes, he manages to be a cut above the rest, so people are right to remember him so fondly. Unfortunately, due to some of the aftermarket stickering situations, I can't quite give him a full score. Several Generation 1 figures still look magnificent even without the addition of stickers, but Stalker just ain't one of them. Also, the cannon can be a little bit cumbersome in most situations, especially in robot mode. But aside from those issues, he is a remarkable robot, and if you're even slightly interested in collecting vintage Transformers and you like the look of this, well, you really can't go wrong. And with that all said, here's to an eventual upgrade. May Hasbro stalk out every possibility they can and deliver a truly amazing figure.